So, having begun this journey with really big Enterprise refits, I'm now going to go to the other end of the scale. And you'll have seen this Katinga, possibly a D7, in that original cloaking shot for the intro to this video. Now, there's an interesting sort of story behind this potentially, which the Cosmic Toy Man suggested to me in a comment on another video. You'll see that here that this is actually a Dinky toy. And you'll recall that Dinky did a very large D7 back in the day, but well before this. So this is 79 that this was made. You can see there on the wing it says copyright 1979, made in England, just for a change, not China. So that's nice. And this is a Klingon cruiser. Now, if you think back to the original Star Trek films, you might recall that this ship appears in both the motion picture and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And the latter is not something that I'd immediately picked up on until someone once pointed that out to me in a video. Because in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, this cruiser is part of the Kobayashi Maru scenario. So it's actually exactly the same shots, I believe, as appear in the motion picture, where the Klingons challenge the Vija cloud. But it's basically does mean that this ship appears in both 1 and 2. And apparently, the Cosmic Toy Man's theory is that the toy companies thought that the motion picture was going to do well, and then it didn't so much. So they brought out toys for the motion picture, which didn't really necessarily hit it off massively well. But then, of course, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan came along, and that did do well. So at that point, they thought, okay, we're going to release toys again for Star Trek 3 because Star Trek 2 did well. But the packaging for this cruiser was for Star Trek 2, as if it was a Wrath of Khan cruiser, but it's not really in the film. So that does, to my mind, make a certain amount of sense, that theory, because it means that what they could have done was repackaged the stuff like this, which was Corgi's take on the D7 battle cruiser, which is the Katinga class battle cruiser, which, as you can see, is somewhat smaller, not massively, but very similar colour scheme, and both have stickers on the wing. They decided that they would sort of repackage it as a Star Trek II ship, which they could kind of get away with. And so what would have been coming into play from the motion picture actually looked like it had been brought out for Star Trek II instead. And the Enterprises were also the same in both of those movies, so they could do that on the same basis. So we have a Dinky and a Corgi there. But we also then got a Dinky and a Corgi Enterprise for the refits. So here we have the Dinky, which goes with this battle cruiser. As you can see, Dinky toys there. And again, this would be 79. Can't immediately see the... Yes, this is there. So you can see this again is 79. So these two would have been a pair at the time. And this would also have been a pair. But this little Corgi Enterprise is quite hard to find, because this was one of the last Corgis to come out under the Corgi name at that point in time, because both Corgi and Dinky were coming to the end of their sort of original survival times there as toy companies, sadly. So these actually represented some of the last products from them, and certainly maybe the last licensed products from them in the sort of the late 70s, early 80s. And I'm sure they probably weren't the last in terms of sort of overall production, but they're probably not far off. So, there's a little bit of sort of toy history going on there in terms of these being very early examples of Star Trek merchandise, but not being quite enough to rescue those particular companies, unfortunately. So yeah, kind of bittersweet on that front. But for me personally, I had one of these, and as you saw in the intro, I now have several of these. But I used to fly these around endlessly because I viewed them as an aggressor ship for anything going, and anything Corgi size, of course, they were very well suited to chase. So I used to chase Buck Rogers Starfighter, small version, with my Klingon D7/Katinga. So, you know, I loved this growing up because it's virtually indestructible, being metal. Only this is plastic. The rest of it is all metal. So, you know, it's pocket size. You slot it in your pocket. You can bring it out at break times, fly it around the place. You use your imagination and it's wherever you want it to be. Great toy. Great little toy. I never had this. I never had this. I never had this. Those are all pickups that I've got in this, rebirth of my collecting, if you like. I also picked this up. Now, this is curious to me because I don't know how common it is for this unit to be black. I don't know if someone's coloured that in, or if it's a sort of a slight rarity that's black there. But nevertheless, it would otherwise seem to be a standard Corgi Katinga from that era. It's just slightly different coloration on top of it. So, answers on a postcard if you happen to know if there's, whether or not there's any particular significance to that as a concept. But that is the one that I've picked up. Now, as I view these very much as toys because they didn't come with stands. They just came as is, and I certainly played with them as toys, as Corgi toys, as Dinky toys, because they made toys. They didn't do models. That wasn't really what their aim in life was. So I would consider these toys. And for me, as I say, that Klingon ship is very much one of my growing up toys, big style, And I do sort of vaguely remember seeing them in Woolworths at the time. And obviously I don't have any carded ones, but I do remember seeing the double pack of the Enterprise, the Enterprise and the Klingon battle cruiser on the shelves, and I've seen them on eBay since as a twin pack. So all of these were, great little die cast with a little tiny bit of plastic toys. So really, getting towards the end of the die cast era in many respects, but not quite the end of the die cast era, because I'm going to show you some other ones. And again, these may tie into Cosmic Toyman's theory about what was going on with the licensing of the Star Trek movies at the time, because I'm going to show you some Ertls now. Now, I've done some videos on these before because, again, these were ones that I very much loved growing up, but I didn't necessarily have all of them. My favourites were the Klingon Birds of Prey. So let me show you these as a starter for 10. So what we have here is an interestingly coloured Klingon Bird of Prey by Ertl. This one is pure metal. But interestingly, this is from Star Trek 3. So you can see there that this is somewhat later, and this is copyright 1983, Paramount Pictures. I don't think it actually announces what it is, but it does announce that it's by Ertl. As you can see, this one has a little stand, and these stands were common to all of the Ertl ships that were released in this particular range. So here we have Star Trek 3. Now, I'm just going to think about my ordering here, because also with Star Trek 3, I believe, was this one. This was, of course, the Excelsior. And we do see the Excelsior, I think, for the first time in Star Trek 3, as I recall. I don't think we see her on screen until 3. And her registry there is rather odd, because in 3 she should have been NX 2000, because she hadn't got a registry at that point. But I think originally they thought she might have been the NCC 1799, and that's why we see this used as the Ertl registry on the hull. I'm a little bit rustier on these. I haven't checked all of the backstory for these as I did when I first showed these, but you can see this again is dated 1983. So I used to fly this around in lieu of having an Enterprise because I didn't have an Enterprise. So both of these were for some time my go-to toys for whizzing around out of my pocket, just like the Klingon Katinga had been before. And I loved the bird. I've always loved bird of prey, and you will see several more bird of preys over the course of this video playlist if you stick with it. So we have two here, both of which are from the third movie, and this ties in with Cosmic Toyman's theory that because Wrath of Khan did well, they thought, right, we're going to make toys for Star Trek 3 then on that basis. And then of course Star Trek 3 probably didn't do as well as Wrath of Khan, so then they didn't cover 4 as much. Well, they didn't cover 4 full stop. Ertl certainly didn't. So what we then have is, actually scratch that. They thought 3 was going to do well, so they did toys for 3, but then 3 didn't do so well, so they didn't do toys for 4, but 4 did do well, so then they did toys for 5, which of course was shocking. So for 5, what we got was this. So we got exactly the same bird of prey mould, but in a much more garish colour. And for the longest time, I really disliked this colour, but now I actually appreciate it a little bit more for being more, at least greener, and therefore more realistic. It actually looks a bit strange on camera as I'm filming it, but it is actually quite a good green camouflagey sort of colour. So although it's not particularly screen accurate, I do give Ertl props for having recoloured it for Star Trek 5. And of course, it's not the same bird of prey as it was for Star Trek 3 and 4. It's a completely different bird of prey, but it is another Klingon bird of prey. But then finally, also for 5, we got an Enterprise. Now, interestingly, now that I look at this with the benefit of hindsight, this is a 1701 Enterprise. It's not a 1701A, which it should be for 5. But I'm just going to look at the date on here quickly, because I wonder if... yes, so this was 1983. So actually, although they did re-release the Enterprise for 5, they also released the Enterprise for 3 then, logically. So actually, and with my apologies to you, all of these 3 in the front here are from Star Trek 3. So the Bird of Prey, the Excelsior, and what should of course be a rather battered 1701 are from the Wrath of Khan, well, not from the Wrath of Khan, from the Search for Spock. And those were Ertl's original sort of release for the Star Trek movies. But that Bird of Prey did also get, the green Bird of Prey did also get another Enterprise release. But now I'm going to have to go in a slightly different direction, because you'll hear me rustling. And the reason I'm rustling is that a gentleman who I picked up some other items from as part of a rather glorious Star Trek merchandise collection that he was selling on eBay, put these up for sale when I was getting something else. And I realized at the time that I probably did have examples. In fact, I'm just thinking whether I have another... actually, yes, I can do this slightly faster actually than I thought. Yeah, so I'm going to do it this way. So I will come back to these ships, but I can show you a carded one of these. And here you will see the Ertl card that these ships came on for Star Trek 5. So Star Trek 5, The Final Frontier, but here you can see they have adjusted the registry for the Enterprise. So the Enterprise is now essentially the same model as the one I've just shown you, but it is the A. So they reused both molds rather cleverly. So they've been able to utilise both the Bird of Prey from 3 and the Enterprise from 3, and just slightly modified the paint job for both of them to give us overall more ships that are accurate to the movie that they're saying they're from, but we have completely skipped Star Trek 4, and we've only sort of grazed Star Trek 2 because the Corgi releases kind of repackaged themselves, even though they were probably for the motion picture originally. So we have this really sort of bitty outcome. And I'm just going to show you these other ones that I've got as well on the card. So you probably won't see overly many of these days, but here we have on its card the Ertl Star Trek 3 Enterprise. Somewhat yellow. I can't quite decide if that's yellowing just from the outer plastic or from the inner plastic, but I suspect the metal hasn't yellowed, so I think that might just be the surrounding bubble that's perhaps got a little bit yellowed. But we have here again a Star Trek 3 Bird of Prey. Try and keep those in shot if I can. And then the Star Trek 3 Excelsior. So really nice to have these on the card. I imagine all the cards are the same on the reverse. So the entire line of Star Trek 3 from Ertl, it does include some figures. I've never had the figures. I have seen them, but I haven't got them. Now this does say copyright 1984, so it's a little later than the actual models indicates. The good old Ertl Collectors Club is mentioned there, but it's really nice to have them on the card just to get the extra detail here. So made in Hong Kong, but for the Ertl company in Iowa. So we have all three of those then for Star Trek 3, and in addition to the Enterprise there for Star Trek 5, we also have the Bird of Prey. Now this is not quite as interesting as they were for the Star Trek 3 backs, unfortunately. They're in fact decidedly less interesting, presumably because they literally just repainted these two ships and that was it. There were no figures for Star Trek 5. All you get is the two ships, which are, effectively, as I've said, just repaints of the original ships from Star Trek 3, and they don't bother with the Excelsior because it doesn't turn up in Star Trek 5. So, that's basically Ertl's range, barring the figures, for the original movies from Star Trek. So only 3 and 5 get covered, 4 are left alone, 2 get a rebrand from Corgi, and the motion picture doesn't really, although they seem to produce for it, if Cosmic Toyman is correct, they didn't seem to, they may have held off on the packaging and then sort of decided to go with them again when Star Trek 2 came out. So a slightly sort of dotty start in terms of coverage there, but these are, apart from any sort of construction model kits that were out at the time, of which there probably were some, I'm sure, but in terms of actual sort of pre-painted toys and so on, Ertl may well have been, and Dinky and Corgi, may well have been the only people who are actually doing them. And these, at the time of the films, were the closest releases to the time of the films themselves. So, which is why I grabbed them, because I do remember these being on sale in my local toy shop in North Wales. I very, very clearly remember picking up the Bird of Prey and Excelsior. I can't remember for the life of me why I didn't get the Enterprise. I'm not quite sure why I didn't pick up the Enterprise. Maybe I only saw it in a battered state in Star Trek 2. No, in Star Trek 3, sorry. And I thought the Excelsior was cooler because it was the newer ship, and I felt sorry for it because it got sabotaged. That might be my childhood thinking. It's possible. It's vaguely possible. that was the computation I made when I only got those two, or they didn't have any of those. I'm not quite sure, but I definitely preferred the Bird of Prey. I might even have had 2 Birds of Prey at the time. As you can see, I've already picked up several again. Now, you might be wondering whatever happened to the Reliant. But I liked Cosmic Toyman's theory for this, because if they thought that Star Trek 2 was going to go the same way as the motion picture, perhaps no one picked up the toy license for it at the time. And that is why we don't have Reliant toys, because no one took the Star Trek II Wrath of Khan license until much later. But even then, much later, they still didn't get toys. So Playmates and Diamond Select still didn't cover it, even when they presumably could have had the license. So again, weird. But we do have a Johnny Lightning. Now, you might argue that this is just like an Eagle Moss. And ironically, this is actually a plastic toy with a die-cast metal stand, strangely. These go for quite a lot of money when they're carded. I personally don't really see it. They're they're a little bit more colourful than average, perhaps, but they're a little bit smaller than, well, but about the same perhaps as an Eagle Moss standard sort of release. But this is as close as you really get to having a die-cast style of toy for the Reliant from Star Trek II. I mean, when you stop and think about it, so many of these ships do get reused throughout the original series of Star Trek films that it doesn't really matter, in the sense that there aren't really that many different ships to pick from to actually make toys of from this line. But the Johnny Lightnings came much later in terms of production, so it's a bit of an odd one out here, but I've included it for the sake of balance, because apart from the Klingon bird of prey that appears everywhere, and obviously the Dinky and Corgi Katingas, it is the only other enemy ship, I think, that we see. So there's no sign of the Berth from Star Trek 3. The Ertl didn't bother with that one, I guess because it's just not viewed as a sort of a hero ship kind of ship, but we just don't see it. So the only sort of real overlap that we've got, well, in fact we don't have overlap, because the only thing that we have overlap on is the Enterprise, because this is the same Enterprise as would have appeared in Star Trek 3, which means it is the same as this Enterprise, as the Ertl Enterprise there. So that is about the only sort of real overlap that we have between all these sort of small die-cast issues of the various ships. But all we've got is Klingon, Katinga, Bird of Prey. We've got the Excelsior, the Enterprise, and we've got, as I say, a Reliant that came much, much later. There was no Reliant that was concurrent with the films actually being released. So it's a sort of odd situation, really, because I would have thought that spaceships generally would have been quite popular at the time. So I don't know why they didn't, sort of jump on them faster at the time when the films were coming out. But I guess the problem was that the market would still have been very saturated by Star Wars toys at that point. And one fundamental difference between a ship like this and a Star Wars toy is that this does not lend itself to putting action figures in, because it's too big. Star Trek did not do fighter ships until much, much later. So, it's either this or shuttles, basically. Shuttles you can get people in, but even then, you've got to do them pretty large to accommodate more than one person. And again, that doesn't really lend itself to toy making terribly much. So, it's kind of an oddly limited number of toys for something that popular. But what we do get later on, of course, is more models in this range. Now, I'm kind of excluding models from this playlist, but I will include the electronic ones. So we do get some great big birds of prey. We do get, obviously, which I've already shown you, some big Enterprises. And there are a few other ships around the edges as well that I can show you. But it is kind of odd, but also at the same time not, because there aren't many more ships other than these in front of you that we actually see. I mean, the Bird of Prey gets reused throughout the whole run. So once it's introduced in 3, it appears in 4 and 5 and 6 and in Generations. You just can't get away from the Birds of Prey, and they are always causing trouble. And even the Katinga comes back in 6 as well. So, you just don't see a huge variety of ships throughout the whole run until we get into the Next Generation era, when of course CGI has become a thing, and then we open a new chapter. But I'm going to leave it there for now, because this has been a relatively long one for a relatively sort of handful of different models of ship. But it's an interesting period in time, because to my mind, Ertl kind of picked up the baton from Dinky and Corgi and other older companies in terms of carrying on a die-cast tradition. Because, you know, this is a solid hunk of metal. All these Ertls, apart from the nacelles, are solid hunks of metal. So they are very much continuing in the tradition set by Corgi and Dinky in terms of how they're approaching toys. But Ertl was smarter about their licensing. Ertl were very, very focused on licensing popular TV series and so on, and that's why they grabbed the film licenses. So they just sort of, they very smoothly filled the gap left by people like Dinky and Corgi as they gradually faded out of the market, because going die-cast was probably still expensive. So they kept themselves, you know, they made much smaller models, but they mass marketed them because they had the license to drive the sales behind them. So it's an interesting snapshot of toy history, I think, of the early 80s, if nothing else. So let me know in the comments if you picked up any of these when you were little, and if these were your spaceship playthings of choice, as they were mine largely. And I think we'll probably jump to a slightly larger scale next time. I'm just thinking in terms of what I've got to show you next time, but I'm going to have to sort of figure out how rapidly I want to go through this particular era before we start transitioning across into the next gen movies. So I'll leave it there for now. Do like and subscribe as ever, and see you shortly. Bye for now.